Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Linda Zerilli, and I have the pleasure of chairing this panel, which is called Transformational Texts. And the idea behind this panel was to ask some of our distinguished faculty to speak a bit about how gender and sexuality studies has influenced their own research and teaching, particularly research, but also teaching. So what I'm going to introduce each one in the beginning, and then we will go in alphabetical order as it is on the program. So Lauren Berlant, over here, is the George M. Pullman Distinguished Service Professor of English Language and Literature at the University of Chicago. She's been here since 1984, and she is the author of The Anatomy of National Fantasy, Hawthorne, Utopia and Everyday Life, The Queen of America Goes to Washington City, Essays on Sex and Citizenship, The Female Complaint, The Unfinished Business of Sentimentality in American Culture, and Cruel Optimism, and other books, but I'm going to stop there. George Chauncey, who we're delighted to have back here, who was an interim director at the center and is now the Samuel Knight Professor of History and American Studies at Yale University, who's the author of Gay New York, Gender, Urban Culture, and the Making of the Gay Male World, 1890 to 1940, and Why Marriage? The History Shaping Today's Debate over Gay Equality. And he's currently completing a book called The Strange Career of the Closet, Race, the City, and Gay Culture and Politics for the Second World War to the Gay Liberation Era. Susan Gall, who's the May and Sidney G. Metzl Distinguished Service Professor of Anthropology, of Linguistics, and of Social Sciences in the college, and Director of the Center for Eastern European, Russian, and Euro-Asian Studies. Sue is the author of Language Shift, Social Determinants of Linguistic Change in Bilingual Austria, a co-author with Gail Klingman of The Politics of Gender After Socialism, a comparative historical essay, and editor with Gail Klingman of Reproducing Gender, Politics, Publics, and Everyday Life After Socialism, and with Catherine Woolard of Languages and Publics, The Making of Authority. Rochona Majumdar is the Associate Professor in the Departments of Cinema and Media Studies and South Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. That's here, duh. The author of Marriage and Modernity, Family Values in Colonial Bengal, Writing Post-Colonial History, and also the co-editor with Dipesh Chakrabarty and Andrew Sartori of From the Colonial to the Post-Colonial, India and Pakistan in Transition, and with Margaret Perno, Helga Jordheim of Civilizing Emotions, Concepts in 19th Century Asia and Europe. Martha Nussbaum is the Ernst Freud Distinguished Service Professor of Law and Ethics at the University of Chicago. Once again here, appointed in the Law School and Philosophy Department. She's an associate in the Classics Department, Divinity School, also my department, Political Science, and so on. Martha is the author of many books. I will name a couple of them: The Fragility of Goodness, Luck and Ethics in Greek Tragedy and Philosophy, Love's Knowledge, Sex and Social Justice, Women and Human Development. More recently, From Disgust to Humanity, Sexual Orientation and Constitutional Law, and Why Love Matters for Justice, and Anger and Forgiveness, Resentment, Generosity, Justice. And Geoffrey Stone, who is the Edward H. Levi Distinguished Service Professor of Law at the University of Chicago, author of Perilous Times, Free Speech in Wartime, From the Sedition Act of 1798 to the War on Terrorism, War and Liberty, An American Dilemma, and Speaking Out, Reflections on Law, Liberty, and Justice. And I should also say Jeff works for, what? I introduced Lauren. Lauren was first. We're in alphabetical order here, don't worry. I'm sure Lauren would remind me. In any case, and it's okay, we're friends. And Jeff, I should also say, writes a column for the Huffington Post and was provost when the center was founded. We talked about that last night, who's been a very good friend of the center, so. Okay, so we'll go in the order, alphabetical order, starting with Lauren.
Hi, I'm Lauren. My designated pronoun is they, but I'd just like to destroy it, so everything, so. All right, so the first thing I'd like to do today is to thank the staff at CSGS, Gina Olson, with whom I've worked for over a decade, and Tate Brazas and Sarah Tui. Although people yesterday put an intellectually and visionary collaboration with the staff into the past of a utopian intention, the CSGS staff continues to be not an administrative unit carrying out the demands and needs and fulfilling faculty and student requirements, but genuine consultants in everything we do, from our imagination of how things might be, from the finest details to content and curricular framing and discussion. And sometimes collaboration means not delegating work to other people, because showing up and doing the work is one of the things we do. We've been incredibly lucky from the beginning to work with people who are committed to a broad range of knowledges and actions that relate to the study of gender and sexuality, and who are game for the hard work of making spaces for transformative thought and practice. Showing up with whatever one has is at the heart of genuine, as opposed to formalist world-making. I'm so grateful for that care, open mutuality, and vegan food from the depth of my low cholesterol heart. The charge for this Transformative Texts panel at the CSGS 20th Anniversary FET was to discuss the influence that gender and sexuality studies in general, but especially at Chicago, has had on our work, and in particular to consider ways in which we could converse across disciplinary frameworks across some common themes. Gay marriage and activism were suggested, but I thought I might focus on other things, and surprisingly those things are theoretical. The whole problem of the common theme in gender and sexuality studies. I begin by noting that I am fundamentally a teacher, and it is the teaching, the co-teaching and editing that I've done with others that matters to me most. Elizabeth Freeman, Anil Ramaya, Jennifer Spruill, Ashley Campy, Jay Sosa, Ali Fieser, Omi Shu, Michael Dango, and many others shaped and experimented with what worked and what matters in the graduate and undergraduate core classroom. I've also been blessed to teach with Kristen Schilt in the undergraduate theories course, and although we don't know if we'll ever find a third person to teach with us or to hand the course off to, it's been an amazing, exciting, and frame-transforming experience becoming a teacher in this context. Anyway, what I'll try to do now is track how working in this context has shaped some fundamental interests in my work. First, a little storytelling. As Beth and George said so beautifully yesterday, before there was a center, there were workshops. And then there was a faculty-student reading group at the Frankie for a year. That workshop was unbelievably painful, as we tried to teach each other what a set of recognizable questions look like from the perspective of how we sat in our disciplines. If anyone hoped that something like political solidarity or a common theory emanating from all kinds of disciplines, anthropology, history, psychology, psychoanalysis, aesthetics, sociology, philosophy, political theory, and biology, would provide a smooth plane of convergence or knowledge commons among us, this reading group experience squashed that hope pretty quickly and definitively. Disciplinary differences, institutional hierarchy, clashing aspirations among and between faculty and students. It was a really tense space, although not without its pleasures, because, after all, we were talking about things that matter to us and that were not at the time considered central to our disciplinary homes, either at all or in the ways we addressed questions. But because it was clear that no common idiom was in sight, we decided to take on the non-identity of different knowledge traditions in our initial curriculum. Our initial course structure was this: problems in the study of gender, which was basically historical, problems in the study of sexuality, which was basically everything else, and then a third course co-taught, which was a feminist pedagogy course for graduate students. Not a course in teaching feminism, but a course in the tradition of feminist pedagogical experimental practice commitments. In my version of it, it was a topical course where students got to teach specific problems from their perspectives, and then for the coursework, write a syllabus and a paper on their syllabus. And some of the best and most transformative work I've seen here came from that course. I think for others, it was more a scene of disciplinary debate. Whatever it was, staffing it was also a nightmare because it takes faculty out of their primary research zones. And at the University of Chicago, faculty don't like being taken out of their primary research zones. Plus, eventually, the interdiscipline of gender and sexuality here could not overcome the fact that grad students are here to learn disciplines. Here, too, there was a lot of methodological and personal stress. And by was, I mean is. Although, which tells you I'm not a historian. Although most of it goes without saying at this point, because people will tend to avoid kinds of knowledge outside of their comfort zone. For example, between feminism and LGBTQI, and feminism and queer theory, especially because between women of color feminism and anti-racist theory generally, and white Europeanist traditions and scenes, between liberal colonialist and anti-colonial visions of different stories, and so on. I believe that the graduate component of CSGS continues to be a problem because interdisciplinarity is very demanding and may be impossible, and also not everyone's desire. But there was a good outcome to this problem too. So we faced that there was no common object, method, or attachment to theoretical infrastructures. There were commonly recognized matters of concern related to embodied situations of power, difference, and inequality. We responded to this situation by using the case study as our way of organizing knowledge in our courses. The purpose of the case study method was to organize different disciplinary ways of addressing a question. The question of sumptuary laws or dress, the question of citizenship, of slavery and contract, of rape, abortion, pornography, of the education of children, and at the university, for example. We would try to make sure different disciplinary mediations of these topics would disturb our assurance in them. And this would also shake up who the default subject of CSGS study was, where she lived and migrated from, how she was racialized, and how her she-ness as common referent, in fact, had to be problematized itself, how exploitation and class history, transgenerational inheritances, gendered standing in the law couldn't be presumed. The case study became, as a result of this procedure of demanding the overdetermination of our objects of study, the opposite of what the case study usually is. Usually a case elevates something to a generality, a kind of thing, a kind of event, a kind of person. Once the person or event has been delaminated from their singularity into a kind of thing that can be compared to other things and circulated as generalizations whose patterning can tell us something about how the world reproduces itself and runs into trouble when it encounters inconvenient subjects or revolutionary breaks or system failures or more glitches. But at the Center for Gender Studies, the purpose of the case study was not to make one kind of thing, but was to multiply associations with a question or a topic, rather than to produce a plane of consistency from it, which is to say it was the opposite of what the case study usually is here. The commitment to decalcifying or loosening or disturbing the presumptive object in the moment of encountering patterns of generalization about it made me want to teach seminars on the case study and to edit a special issue of Critical Inquiry on it in 2007, because it turns out there's been a lot of transdisciplinary discussion about how we exemplify our objects and scenes and what we do when we can't achieve generality. John Forster says, a case is what you proceed with when you don't have a theory. I wrote my essay, Slow Death, for that issue, an essay whose first appearance in the world was at a 2002 conference at the Center for Gender Studies on poverty and obesity, co-sponsored with the now famous sociologist Virginia Chang back when she was a grad student, and thought through with Virginia and Gina for hours on that couch we heard about yesterday, and read Tremel too. And really, it was fantastic. The planning was amazing. The group of keynotes, the social historian Peter Stearns talking about the US and France, the psychoanalyst who invented feminist fat studies, Susie Orbach, talking about the global spread of eating disorders, the cultural historian Sandra Gilman, who told the transnational history of fat erotics as a history of racialization, and then a whole range of philosophers, epidemiologists, artists, historians of the food system, and doctors on day two. It was to bring to the room as many kinds of knowledge as possible to the problem of the extreme distribution of unhealth as a condition of global and local inequality. It was listening to the unbelievable optimism of the epidemiologists that if only people walked 10 more blocks a day or wrote down their food, that health would be returned to them, regardless of race, class, labor, or familial conditions or geopolitical location, that I began to formulate what became Slow Death's conception of lateral agency, an aleatory mode of coasting in the space of exhausted sovereignty that enabled people to live without living well in the normative terms of health, and that made questions of fat, primarily as a feminist issue, change, become racialized and organized by class hierarchies and practices. The largeness or smallness of bodies, and indeed the whole rhetoric of crisis, shifted as a problem scene when eating reappeared as a practice of surviving an economic life that has few and unreliable spaces of rest and pleasure for the people who are making it. As method and interest, all of this came from the way that the Center for Gender Studies, we were training ourselves to overdetermine our own questions. Slow Death was a descriptive challenge about interdisciplinary knowledge itself, and all the ways that's impossible hang in the essay, as it hangs in our classrooms, as a challenge to face the complexities of achieving a genuinely lived equality that's better than the equality of attrition and exposure that is otherwise left to the army of laborers and lovers. Intimacy, its appetites and patterns of attachment that create forms of life and aesthetic mediations, appears here as an infrastructure and interdiscipline of knowledges that don't quite make a case for a satisfying story. But that's what's been good about teaching about it. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. As I said last night, it's really great to be back at the University of Chicago, which was such a formative place for me as a beginning assistant professor and then one. Since I said this last night, and several of us said this last night, but Jeff Stone was at an event at the law school, I want to repeat what I said, and several others. You were a truly inspired provost and played certainly a fundamental role in making it possible to establish the Lesbian and Gay Studies Project, but just supported so many of us in responding to a lot of creative proposals you got, but really putting the institution's weight behind them. And so thank you for that. I think I'm supposed to talk about Gay New York, but but I think that's probably the suspect that got me on this panel. It appeared actually before the center was established, although in the midst of the intellectual ferment that would lead to it. Many conversations with many people who were here or who were once here and have left were really key to my thinking about it and then my subsequent thinking. Actually would really like to single out Leora Auslander, my colleague in the history department, who was such an important teacher to me, as to so many of us here. In thinking about Linda's charge, I realized as we talked about this on email before we came that we all had a slightly different read on what the charge was. So my charge is to think about Gay New York. I read it as a particular moment in a conversation and what shaped it, what did it try to do, and then how has the conversation gone on since in ways that would make me read it, since we're all typically the sharpest critics of our own work. And so I wanted to just briefly talk about it in relation to three fields. One is the relationship of women's and or gender history to the history of sexuality, critical race studies, and then the larger political context in which we do our work and in which we're trying to intervene. So my early work would have been impossible as a practical matter and unthinkable as an intellectual matter without the work of women's historians and gender historians. My advisor and dissertation student at Yale was Nancy Cott, important women's historian. Much of the earliest work on the history of sexuality was done by women's historians, work that's typically forgotten now when Foucault invented the history of sexuality one day. So that Carol Smith Rosenberg's classic 1975 essay on the female world of love and ritual, however one might revise it today and contest it today in a variety of ways, was absolutely agenda setting and really alerted everyone to the historicity of sexual categories and especially the inapplicability of the categories of hetero and homosexuality to earlier times and places. And it was the first essay in the first issue of Signs, which is, I think, an important sign of the centrality of such questions to women's studies. Likewise, early work on working class women's sexuality, Chris Stangel's book, City of Women, on 19th century New York, and Kathy Pice's book, Cheap Amusements, on early 20th century New York, both published in 1986. Both thought really deeply about relationship between what today we would call, what we'd call the history of capitalism and the history of sexuality, particularly how women's movement into the paid labor force and the expanding commercialization or commodification of social relations and so-called reproductive labor, the expansion of commercial amusements and so forth, contributed to a transformation in heterosexual relations. Now, again, this work wasn't theorized in ways that later work would be, but it was really superb social history often gender history under the guise of women's history, which uncovered sources, raised questions, and foregrounded questions of class and working class agency that were all crucial to my own work. And then I can see already I'm going to talk too long. So British gay historians, especially Geoffrey Weeks in his book coming out in 1977, were independently developing arguments about the historicity of sexuality and sexual categories, drawing theoretical encouragement, especially from the work of sociologists, especially Mary McIntosh's early work distinguishing homosexual acts from identities roles. And so a lot of this work predated the English translation of Foucault's History of Sexuality in 78, and I think really influenced my reading of it. It certainly deeply influenced my work, and that along with a queer sensibility that I brought to this work, ultimately led me to question Foucault's and Weeks' account of the emergence of what in those days amongst queer historians was known as the making of the modern homosexual, who seemed unencumbered by family, gender ties, or gender queerness or racial difference. So first in a paper that I wrote in Nancy Cott's graduate seminar on women's history, and then published in 1983 as From Sexual Inversion to Homosexuality, thought a lot about how gender disrupted this emerging narrative. And I, beginning there, and then every place I looked, since I'm an old-fashioned historian in the end, and I actually just look at my sources and try to figure out what's going on in them, I found the centrality of queer gender everywhere, from the medical discourse on lesbianism to naval records about sexual perverts at a Navy base after World War I, to the incredible records about queer life in early 20th century New York. And so charting the discursive presence and social worlds of mannish women and fairies became a really central project for me. And showing how their presence and their centrality to these social worlds and to these discursive formations, and showing how they disrupted an easy historical transition from acts to identity, was really one of the central objectives of my work. But this was before the emergence of trans studies, which meant that I did not think about transgender as a category of identity or experience. So I focused, say, on the frequent self-description of people who talked about having a women's soul and a male body as deeply complicating the genealogy of homosexuality, but simply didn't consider such identity formations as opening up the possibility of a genealogy of transgender. And I think, as David Valentine has also argued, that it's actually more useful to think about these categories or these contradictions as reflecting the reorganization of categories of gender and sexuality over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. But that's a debate that's really only been made possible by the emergence of trans studies, and for that I'm very grateful. Two other fields, one work on race. The work of Black historians provided a central model for my own work, particularly the flurry of studies in the 80s on the first great migration of African Americans from the South to the North during the First World War era, the formation of northern Black communities and ghettos. This work was enormously useful to me as a model for thinking about how communities are formed and sustained under urban conditions, and about class and other kinds of conflicts within those communities. And Gay New York, and I'm so proud of this, paid more attention to people of color than most previous queer histories had, and its account of Harlem in the 20s was the longest and most substantial to date. But it really did not foreground race as a central category of analysis in a way that would be almost unthinkable today, especially in a moment when much of the most interesting recent work in the history of sexuality, Ernst, Peggy Pascoe, Chicago's own PhD, Hannah Rosen, many others, has searchingly examined the role of sexual regulation in shoring up the colonial order, sustaining the fantasy of racial purity in which major strands of white supremacy are based, forming the basis for political mobilization and claims to freedom. So in my early work on the medical literature on lesbianism, I didn't think about the ways in which that discourse was profoundly implicated by, I mentioned it, but didn't really think through, implicated with the discourse of scientific racism or the cross-pollination of ideas about racial and sexual difference, or my writing about class conflict. And Naomi was right, the first panel. I talked a lot about class and taught a lot about class, but those conflicts within the gay world wasn't really shaped by thinking about how codes of discretion, gender conformity, or respectability weren't just about class conflict, but a project of racialization. And so this work is part of what's made my finishing my next book so long, trying to actually really do the kind of social history work that would allow it to be a multiracial history of queer culture and politics in post-war New York. But I think it's well worth it. Third, just to say a word about the changing political context of public memory. So most of my work has sought to intervene not just in scholarly debates, but in the field of popular memory, and in a way that I certainly couldn't have imagined when I got my PhD in the courts. And so I'm lucky enough to have been doing this work long enough and through a period of such momentous change that now, 22 years since Gay New York appeared, I'm struck by how much all three fields, from scholarly, popular, and legal, have history and memory have changed, but in curiously different ways. So 25 years ago, at a moment when the fragile gains of the 1970s, a part of the gay liberation movement, were under sustained assault in the Reagan-Bush years, the era of AIDS, the era of the seeming triumph of the Christian right, most people could only imagine that all of gay history before Stonewall had been a story of oppression, isolation, invisibility, and shame. This was also a narrative cultivated by the gay liberation movement, which, like any successful movement, successful more in defeating its opponents within the gay world than in achieving anything outside the world, portrayed itself as marking a decisive break with the past and at the same time as fulfilling the aspirations of all the lost souls who'd come before it. And to a large degree, this narrative was reproduced in scholarly studies. So Gay New York directly engaged with those ideas, or myths that I called them, and sought to counter them by portraying the rich social worlds that people created in early 20th century New York, even in the face of countervailing pressures, though those pressures, I argued, were not as universal as we supposed. But nowadays, my students, my undergraduates, I take to be the embodiment of a certain generational moment in public memory, can barely imagine the extent of anti-gay discrimination and demonization that came before them, given the world in which they've grown up, which seems the natural, inevitable, and transhistorical state of things, as usually any new generation imagines its world to be. And historians in the meantime are still mostly telling the story of unadulterated woe, constant harassment, and overwhelming oppression. The courts, in the meantime, have gone in the opposite direction. So when I testified in the history of anti-gay discrimination for the first time at the 1993 trial in Denver that ultimately resulted in the Supreme Court's decision in Romer v. Evans in 1996, which was really the first major gay rights victory in the Supreme Court, the opposing attorney refused to concede that there had been a history of discrimination. It's actually my easiest cross-examination ever, because it was actually pretty hard for him to argue with me. But as I did as the beginning assistant professor, it was still an experience. More recently, though, opposing historians have conceded this history. It's pretty well established as a matter of scholarship now, and it's indeed embedded in a series of decisions by the Supreme Court, so it's hard for them to argue against it. But instead are trying to undermine its legal significance by arguing that everything has changed and everything has gotten better. We even have a friend in the White House. Now, in the old days, that friend was Hillary Clinton when she was First Lady, and now, of course, it's President Obama, but we've had a friend in the White House for a long time, it seems, and that means everything is great. So one effect of my involvement in this litigation and in the classroom has been to force me to think more capaciously about the manifold and subtle forms of anti-gay discrimination. But the challenge in all these arenas, and it's been a really productive challenge for me, has been to try to balance any account of all the formal and informal policing queer people have faced, often much more draconian than even the worst rhetoric of the gay liberation movement imagined, both with obvious change over time and the remarkable resiliency of people and the much more complex story of the political cultural field in which they built lives, where they often found more support than we usually imagine. I'm really grateful for that challenge, and actually grateful to have been alive at this time and to have witnessed these changes. Here.
I'm Sugal. Do I need this? Yes. Oh, stereo.
You'll be in stereo.
Let me know if you can't hear me. It's a real pleasure to celebrate 20 years of the Gender Studies Center, the CSGS now. Last night's reminiscences were really moving for me. Like some others, I came here from a campus, namely Rutgers, that already had a very lively women's studies center and activities. And arriving, and it was taken for granted that that was an institutionalized part of the Rutgers world. And arriving in 1994 here, I was appalled by Chicago's lack of any such institutionalized form, but incredibly lucky to be warmly welcomed by Leora, Norma, Beth, Lauren, and the others who are working hard to create the center. And I joined to make the rounds, hat in hand, to John Boyer and Jeff Stone, whose generosity bears repeating from last night. Rebecca Zorak talked last night about the Constitution Committee and that fledgling center. The Money Committee, fundraising, that was me, my assignment, and I have to say that we failed miserably. I am all the more impressed by Zerilli's amazing successes. So there's much to appreciate about the center. The collegiality, the provocations and frictions that have been mentioned by Leora, among others, but the confidence and security about the center, having many beautiful rooms of our own, an administrative structure and wonderful staff and programming. That's my piece for last night. The question Linda posed to us for today was, how has gender and sexuality studies at the center influenced our work? And part of the answer for me, the big part, is students that I have met and have been able to work with here. And especially ones that are interested in comparative and transnational questions, which, as George and others have mentioned, have been part of the agenda of this center from the very beginning. Leora, Norma, many people have mentioned it. Let me tell you about two issues that have been important to me. They're closely related issues, and these are ones that have given me the chance to work with students in a way that's been very gratifying and hopefully also good for the students. In 2000, I wrote a book with Gail Kligman about the role of gender discourses in the processes that brought the end of communism. It was inspired by people like Raina Rapp in anthropology, Joan Scott in history, Beth Povinelli, who was a colleague here in anthropology. In every country except Romania, the fall of communism meant abortion was curtailed or outlawed, generous maternity leaves were cut, pensions were ransacked. The Catholic Church took over all the aspects of reproductive policy. Women were put out of work, and the breadwinner model of family was reinstituted. And all this, even if there were some slight exceptions in various places, all this went under the aegis of freedom, civil society, democracy, entrepreneurial opportunity, and rule of law. Mainstream scholarship on the so-called transition from communism completely ignored the way gender discourses and sexual policies legitimated the new forms of power. The book that we wrote paralleled a collaborative effort to involve women of the region to write about their own experiences, intellectuals, social scientists, to write about their own experiences and their own analyses of what it was that they were experiencing and what it was that was happening in the region. And this was important because at the time, Western feminists, US and Western Europe, were arriving en masse in Eastern Europe and telling Eastern European women about the wonders of feminism. And trying to free the oppressed women of Eastern Europe. You laugh now, but the misunderstandings and fights were disastrous and very painful. Ethnographers and anthropologists perhaps found this a little less surprising given the fact that we had been studying these societies and had been colleagues with the women for a while. And we were understanding how gender relations, understandings of sexuality, families, and motherhood were really quite different for structural reasons and for historical reasons in Western Europe, the United States, and in Eastern Europe. So we started to write about the condescensions of Western feminism and, as Ernst said earlier today, making feminism itself as activism and as a political movement an object of analysis. So that experience, those misunderstandings, those really serious traumas, had a deep effect on me. As a linguistic anthropologist, I turned to what I'm going to call the second theoretical issue I've been interested in, and that is the theoretical and practical challenges of cultural and linguistic translation, the process that is required, even with the best of intentions, even among societies that are quite similar to each other, to make transnational, cross-cultural contact, let alone to come to some sort of understanding about shared concerns, or to make, actually, through the process of some sort of translation, shared concerns, and to try to form various kinds of political alliances. So, given those two big concerns of mine, it's been very gratifying to invite students to do feminist political analyses of gender and sexuality discourse, to make feminism an object of study, and to study policy across the world regimes, across political regimes in different parts of the world. And that is, and this is true especially now, because the sleight of hand, one might call it, the magic of semiotic meaning-making that enabled those 1990s legitimations of capitalism and civil society through gender in Eastern Europe are once again active and in very vivid operation. They're now ushering in a turn to right extremism across the entire European continent. Putin's rhetoric is perhaps the most famous. So we've got pro-regime women ripping off their clothes for Putin, homophobic slurs as one-upsmanship among leaders, gay pride parades attacked as obscenity and Western invasion, and all are counting on the popular reactions to a sexualized capitalism seen as Western that impoverishes while pretending to offer freedom. Anti-regime groups like Pussy Riot, that you've probably heard about, and other ones that are quieter, are arrested and prosecuted for challenging these oppressive authoritarian orders. Now, speaking just about Eastern Europe for a second, the migrant crisis that obviously we've all heard about that hit U.S. newspapers this summer was exacerbating something that has been going on for much, much longer, strong xenophobic and racist trends all over Europe, and very particularly in Eastern Europe as well. Many of these right-wing, I'm calling them right-wing parties, are headed by women. That's not the surprise, we know about that. It's the shape and logic of their arguments and effects that interest me. Their increasing complexity. Let me say a few words about that. The way they are making the familiar right-left distinctions that we operate with increasingly incoherent. Right-wing parties are nativist, natalist, anti-migrant, anti-Muslim, anti-Semitic, and anti-Roma, which basically counts as racist in Europe. In the U.S., the region is often stigmatized as the home of nasty ethnic nationalisms, and I often ask students, nasty and ethnic compared to what? Us. These parties are taking advantage of the immiserating effects of the European Union's corporate and banking policies. Ironically, it is also the EU that gives rightist parties funding and enables a really close collaboration among parties from different countries. Just a word about complexity. In Hungary, the extreme right's nativist anti-migrant rhetoric is entangled with leftist feminist critiques of global capitalism. And this is what I wanted to point to as something that's troubling. Kristina Morvay, a rightist leader, argues that in an unequal Europe, Easterners are second-class citizens. Check, good, yes. The women are trafficked for sex work to Western brothels and used for cheap labor in Germany. Yes. She talks about center-periphery patterns of exploitation, a brain drain from east to west, loss of human rights and women's rights through EU's double standards. Now, I hope you hear the you hear the echoes of exploitation, colonialism, human rights, women's rights. So on the one hand, why isn't the EU protecting us from invading migrants, they say. On the other hand, keep EU foodstuffs, regulations, and corporations out of Hungary. So double standards, colonization, exploitation, these are very familiar tropes to all of us. The culprit, however, in these cases is the corporate EU, but also Zionist, gay, and Roma conspiracies. The solution is for Hungarian women to leave the workforce and have more babies to avoid the looming demographic collapse, which is in fact looming. Now, teaching about such matters in our new, very successful civilization sequence has been a revelation for me. And I think the core has also been to some extent integrated. So that was a conversation we had earlier today. So I'm pleased to say that the core sequence is also really quite wonderful. One faces fascinating situations. Students have often been politicized by their feminist parents or by our campus. So the ones who come to the gender core are many times already politicized. They're with the program, if you know what I mean. They are committed to fighting for women's rights and LGBTQ rights. Discussions in the seminar get puzzling and heated because joining NGOs to liberate others is a very common, admirable, and well-intentioned reaction. Yet some students sense the contradictions, and I hope what I've said already shows that there are contradictions in this kind of effort. I remember one conversation I had with Erin Moore many years ago when she was an undergraduate writing her BA paper. We were talking about Nicholas Kristof's encomium to microcredit schemes, women's rights, and girls' empowerment. And that seemed like a good idea at the time. Professor Gao, said Erin Moore very politely, you don't really believe all that stuff, do you? So I've been learning a lot from my students. And what indeed do rights look like in Poland, in Hungary, or for that matter in Egypt, Uganda, or in any post-colonial context? Feminist anthropologists have been arguing for some years that while the language of rights is indispensable in the U.S., in legal structures that resemble those of the U.S. and certain other contexts, it does not travel well. The universalizing of rights is a flattening of gender and sexuality issues. Rights must be recast, rethought across languages, social formations, historical and political divides. The very process of translation, of changing them in such a way as to make sense for people elsewhere, guarantees the very dilemmas of communication and action that we invariably find. It was therefore an incredible experience for me to work with and learn from Julie Kowalski and Erin Moore, Misha Apeltova, and there are lots of others who I won't mention. I don't think that they're here because they're already out in the world. But Erin and Julia both hold now PhDs from the Committee for Human Development. They both wrote path-breaking dissertations on processes of translation of women's rights in feminist NGOs, or in feminist NGOs. They dissected very different problems, wrote insightfully about contextualizations and dilemmas in northern India and Uganda. With my own work in Eastern Europe as kind of a background, we wrote a paper together. Now, it's hard enough to edit something with lots of people involved, but it's much, much harder to actually collaborate on a single paper. And it's much, much harder to collaborate on a single paper that involves at least 3 kinds of ethnographic backgrounds. And it's a tribute to these fine young scholars and to the spirit of this center that we manage through frantic emails and endless revisions to construct a paper I am very proud of, now published in the journal Social Politics. I'm sure that many of you have also done the same thing, faculty and students, but I thought that I would highlight this. It's very clear in my mind because it's only very recently happened. So, as many speakers last night said, the project for the center was somewhat a utopian one, and not everything has materialized, and some of it is unworkable. But in attracting students of such critical acumen and intellectual power, and supporting them in the way that the center has succeeded, it really has been successful in amazing ways. And to be negative in the way that you were last night, the problem that remains is the replenishment of faculty and the maintenance of the support for students such as this in the future, in the near future, under present circumstances in the university.
I'm really honored and humbled and actually quite daunted to be on this panel. But I think my presence on this panel should tell you something about the non-hierarchical ethic that may not prevail in the rest of the university, but certainly does here. I arrived here as a graduate student in 1996, so the same year that the Center for Gender Studies, and it was called the Center for Gender Studies then, was set up. And as I was listening to the panelists last night, I think Linda mentioned it, Norma mentioned it, Beth did, and Sue, you just brought it up again, that the establishment of the center at this university was belated. And as I listened to you all, I kept thinking that true, it was, but that belatedness was actually, it became possibility for me. Because I came to the University of Chicago from India via Oxford. And as Martha knows quite well, in Calcutta, the city where I did my undergraduate education, at the time there was one center for women's studies at a university that I did not attend. And to this day, there are no centers that actually identify themselves as gender centers. Sexuality will never go to the title of any center in India, especially under the current political dispensation. In any case, to come from that background, and in Oxford it was absent. I think, again, it's safe to say that there are not going to be any centers for gender studies in either Oxford or Cambridge anytime soon. But coming from that background here, in that year when the center was established, there was something extraordinarily exciting about studying with people, and many of whom are here on this table, to be in classrooms where people were crackling with excitement. And you imbibe that. Leora Auslander was, is she here? Yes. She was the chair of my dissertation committee, and I remember taking a class with George and Leora that they co-taught. I was in a class that Lauren taught. I can't remember if it was the same year as Queen of America came out or the year before, but nonetheless, it was with Malati D. Alves, and I realized it was one of the problems classes, which was, and I actually took it as a grad student because I hadn't been exposed to any of that before coming here. And over the years, I have engaged a great deal with the written works of the two individuals who actually sit next to me, Martha Nussbaum and Lauren Berlant. Debbie Nelson's class on postmodern autobiographies, your first class in the first quarter, I was there. So my books, Marriage and Modernity, Writing Postcolonial History, as well as my current project, Art Cinema, The Indian Career of a Global Category, bear the imprint of these years. One theme that returns repeatedly in my work is the relationship between norm and history. In fact, listening to the discussion that came after the first panel today, I was thinking that norms are incredibly important to me. So all the dead white men and some handful of dead white women, but mostly white, these people are incredibly important to who I am as a scholar, in large measure because reading them gives me a sense of the world, but also makes me realize that norms have a seamlessness to them that gets very messy in historical application. So in my book on arranged marriage, for example, where I wrote, the last chapter of it was on a set of laws called the Hindu Code Bill. There were a set of laws that gave Hindu women in 1955 and 56 the right to institute divorce proceedings, the right to inherit property after they got married, inherit paternal property. One of the things that I showed quite clearly was that it was the extended family, what we often call the joint family in India, rather than the individual female citizen subject, who emerged as the subject of what Lynn Hunt called the family romance in modern India. I mean, she was writing about the French context. So querying how certain universalist ideas about rights, interests, choice play out in particular historical contexts, in my case, India, and especially how modern emancipatory endeavors such as feminism bear the impact or the imprint of the local and the historical is something that is at the core of my research. Put differently, as a historian, I'm committed to querying, and here I shall borrow from you, querying why women in what you call why women are so invested in what you call cruel optimism. In your incredibly powerful formulation, a relation of cruel optimism exists when you desire something that is an obstacle to your flourishing. As a scholar who works from a post-colonial vantage on modern India, I approach this question by analyzing the rubric of women's desires for relationships that often go in ways that are against their interests. And I think ideology critique or certain normative critiques fall short in understanding these choices fully. Nor is it fruitful to measure their desires against, as I said, against liberal or any other standards of rights or duties. This sense of the self, whether it's as a lover, a mother, a sister, a daughter, a wife, they're historically conditioned, they're products of history. And I take it to be my task as a scholar to patiently track the historical twists and turns of Indian family values. In my earlier work, I analyzed the reformulation of family values in the context of colonial rule. In my current work on Indian art cinema, I analyze how the family value politics that came to be enshrined as modern in the colonial period is actually now being depicted in ruins under the pressure of cultural and institutional modernization that followed Indian independence in 1947. There is, however, no clear enunciation of what will replace what used to be called the new patriarchy in the colonial period that we became familiar with under the conditions of colonial rule. In the absence of a programmatic politics, however, it is important to read closely the ways in which the figure of the woman, in many of my films, the films that I work with, operates as a site of critique and also absorbs the quotidian violence that takes place every day. Thank you.
Well, when I came here, I was already pretty old. I'd been teaching for 20 years. And so what I want to talk about is how, nonetheless, I mean, what did I have underway when I came here, and how has it changed by the center? Now, I came from Brown, and Brown was long one of the pioneering institutions, both in women's studies, as it was called, and in the study of lesbian and gay sexuality. So we had the Pembroke Center that was like from the middle 70s. I didn't come to Brown until 1984, but for all the 11 years that I was there, Joan Scott directed the Pembroke Center. It was an extremely central theoretical place for the whole university. And at the same time, the university was really open to the study of sexuality. So already in 1985, we had a major conference that the university funded on homosexuality in history and culture, at which it's amazing to remember the speakers were the late John Boswell, the late Jack Winkler, Biddy Martin, who's flourishing as president of Amherst, and my friend David Halperin, who is flourishing at Michigan. But so we were on the cutting edge, and by 1993, we had actually established the first undergraduate concentration in lesbian and gay studies in the country, I think. I mean, at least that was our belief. So I already had underway work that touched on all these areas in terms of the sort of the women's studies part. I had long been collaborating with economists and feminists in other countries on what's known as the capabilities approach, pioneering a new way of looking at global development that was much more friendly to people's strivings and concerns on the ground, and not just measuring everything with reference to economic growth. So I'd partnered with economist Amartya Sen, but also with very courageous feminist activists like Ela Bhatt, the founder of the Self-Employed Women's Association, and the one who headed that center in Calcutta that Rochona mentioned, namely Jasodhara Bagchi, a very courageous and excellent feminist scholar who basically created single-handedly women's studies in India. So I was doing all this stuff and writing basically all of what went into sex and social justice, women and human development. I was also, and my my other area in philosophy is the study of the emotions, the philosophical study of the emotions, and I had already written quite a good deal on that, although my book, Upheavals of Thought, did not come out until 2001. I gave the lectures that it was based on in 1993 and came here in 95. So that was basically done too. And as far as lesbian and gay sexuality, like George, I was an expert witness in Romer v. Evans in a very weird part of that trial, where certain witnesses for the state claimed that Plato and Aristotle thought that homosexuality was an abomination, as did all of Greek culture. So I was called as a rebuttal witness to those people. So, it had touched on my scholarship, and then I started to write about constitutional law in that area. So I came here, and I want first of all to say that I received tremendous support for my further work in these areas from both the law school and the philosophy department. There has never been any hesitation on either front to say that this kind of interdisciplinary scholarship is very important, and that was true not only for me, but for other people as well. But so when I got here, the center was under development, and I was not really part of the development, but I was able to take part in some of the exciting conversations that were already underway with Beth and Norma and Leora. And then later, being on the board of the center, I got to know Lauren and George and Bert Kohler and other wonderful people. So what did I find, and what was it that changed what I had already brought with me from Brown? The first thing I want to draw attention to is the conception that was much talked about at the time of the founding, that the center was going to be a big tent with no orthodox brand of feminism, no orthodox theoretical commitment, but a place where many different theoretical styles and commitments could converse openly and civilly. And that was very important in the founding. And I believe that that's still extremely important and difficult to maintain. But at Brown, Joan Scott was such a powerful personality that really that didn't exist, that basically her direction for the Pembroke Center was the direction for the center. And it wasn't that she was narrow-minded at all, but it was like she didn't think of it as part of her mandate to create a home for diversity and for the unpacking of the differences between different theoretical approaches. So I found that remarkably energizing and fertile, and it really did change both my teaching and my scholarship. First of all, the teaching. So I teach feminist philosophy. I had been teaching it at Brown already, but now I structure it around these theoretical divisions. Liberal feminism, I mean, of course, it's a philosophy course, so there is a limit to what you can include, but liberal feminism, difference feminism, queer theory, and then also, of course, the radical feminism of McKinnon and Dworkin. And I do all of those things in the class. And I'm going to, next spring, when I teach it again, include a segment on trans issues, which I had never done. So in all these ways, being on the board of the center and getting to know all these people was very energizing. But with respect to my scholarship, so I had been working on emotions. I began thinking much more about shame and disgust. And that was because of my association not only with people in queer theory here, like Lauren and George, but people elsewhere, David Halperin in particular. And that led to my 2004 book, Hiding from Humanity, where I gave a philosophical analysis of disgust and shame, but then tried to show how it worked in both misogyny and homophobia, and then made an argument that the law, of course, it's long been a tradition in legal theory on the conservative side, that the strong disgust of an average member of society is a sufficient condition for making a practice illegal, even if it causes no harm. So I went at Lord Devlin from a new direction, from a direction that focused particularly on the politics of disgust and not on a much more general Millian liberal argument. And I was able, I think, to do something new in that argument, simply because my work had been informed by the work going on in queer theory. The other thing I want to draw attention to, and I'm sure this has happened a lot last night and now, is the fact that this is gender. At Brown, I was involved in conversations both about women's studies and about lesbian and gay studies, but they were two completely separate groups of people. Absolutely separate. So the Pembroke Center took no interest in the stuff we were doing on lesbian and gay studies. And by the same token, the people I was working with on lesbian and gay studies, particularly very great scholar Saul Olean from religious studies, who works on gay studies of biblical scholarship, they really didn't take much interest in women's studies, and so and the students were two separate groups of students. So when Saul and I had a conference in about 1993 or something on homosexuality and human rights in the major U.S. religious traditions, I don't think that the people from the Pembroke Center showed up at all. So, okay, so here I found something that was much more carefully thought through, with, I think, a much deeper intellectual integrity. What I now think in retrospect is that at Brown, these two fields were founded as a result of political needs and demands coming out of oppression, and the two groups reacted to that without ever stepping back and thinking through what the discipline really should look like. But of course, the belatedness of U of Chicago meant that you had to think, what should it look like? And I think the structure of the center, which of course is ongoing and flexible, has much more intellectual richness and integrity. And of course, it's a no-brainer that you should include the whole study of gender and not have women over here and lesbian and gay studies over here, but that was not happening. So I felt that was tremendously energizing and empowering, the conversations we could have on the board with George and Bert Kohler, but also Lauren and so many people. And that led to the work that Linda mentioned in the introduction, From Disgust to Humanity, Sexual Orientation and Constitutional Law, where I do, in fact, talk about the whole range of constitutional issues. It's for a series edited by Jeff. So Jeff was instrumental because he got me invited, or he invited me to do that book. But I tried to put the two parts of myself together in talking about marriage, because of course you have to think about the feminist critique of marriage that was very well developed long ago, but then how it had to change when you start thinking about gender in this broader way. So I hope in that book, but in things that I plan to do in the future, that broader and richer intellectual base has been very formative. And so I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
One of the things that I am most proud of in terms of the accomplishments of the years I was provost was the ability to support the creation of this center. And that was due to extraordinary work by the founding faculty members, most or all of whom are in the room here today. And they deserve all of the credit for this happening. And it was not that easy, in fact, not because of an objection to the idea in the abstract, but because it was a time of scarce resources, and it was a time when we really wanted to insist upon it having the kind of intellectual integrity that Martha described a moment ago. And it wasn't an interest group, but it was an intellectual enterprise, and that was part of the process of working out what that meant. I don't know whether the founding faculty members knew how much, however, I was eager to see this happen from the very first moment. When I was a law clerk to Justice William Brennan on the Supreme Court, I had a small hand in Roe versus Wade, and in writing one of the court's more important gender discrimination cases. In 1987, when I first became dean of the law school, we sponsored the nation's first a conference on sexual orientation and the law at a law school. So I was very much eager to see this happen, but it would not have happened but for the fact of the leadership of our faculty. I'll mention two ways in which my own continuing interest in these fields has manifested itself. One of them is kind of as a lawyer, and the other is as a scholar. one thing I've done over the years is to write a number of friend of the court briefs before the Supreme Court of the United States in most of the major cases that the court has decided dealing with issues of sexual orientation and reproductive rights. So, for example, I've written briefs in Lawrence v. Texas, in Windsor versus United States, in Obergefell versus Hodges, all of which were joined by other constitutional scholars from Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Columbia, Chicago, making the argument to the Supreme Court that the various laws at issue in those cases should be deemed unconstitutional. And we made a particular argument in each case, the same argument more or less in each of those cases. And it was basically that discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation should be understood under the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution as analogous to discrimination on the basis of race or on the basis of gender or on the basis of national origin, on the ground that there has been a long history of oppression on the basis of sexual orientation, and that sexual orientation is not a matter of choice, but is an immutable characteristic of individuals, and therefore is appropriately analogous to race and gender and so on. That is, in my view, the right argument for the court to address these questions, but the court has not embraced that argument in these cases. Instead, in a series of decisions written by Anthony Kennedy, the court has reached the right result in every one of those situations, but it has done so with a weaker set of arguments that leave more room for ambiguity and resolve less questions for the future. So this remains, I think, a critical argument for the court to hear as we go forward. On the reproductive rights side, for example, I authored a brief that was filed in the case pending before the Supreme Court this year on the various regulations from about half the states that do not absolutely prohibit abortion, but which effectively pose barriers to the ability of women to exercise the constitutional right through a long series of disingenuous regulations that are under the guise of protecting the health of the woman, but in fact are designed to raise the price and make it unavailable the opportunity for the choice. And that case is currently pending before the Supreme Court. The brief that I authored, again joined by constitutional scholars at major law schools, makes the argument that, pretty much as I just suggested, that those justifications are disingenuous, they are not sufficiently weighty to warrant the restrictions, and it remains to be seen what the Supreme Court will do on those questions. The other side of what I've done is as an academic, although these two sides obviously reinforce each other, and I'm happy to say I've just, after many years of working on it, just last week completed a book called Sex and the Constitution that will be published next year that tries to take a long view of these issues, that looks at the intersection between sex, religion law, and constitutional law from the founding of the United States up to the present. It tries to show how a religious belief has affected not only private individual belief, but also the law, and how that has dictated individual behavior, even by those people who don't share the faith of those who've put their faith into the law. And so it begins by looking at the world even before the founders, the Second Great Awakening, the evolution over the course of the 19th century of the Comstock era, restrictions for the first time on obscenity, on contraception, on abortion, the role of the American Medical Association, and then begins to look at the influence of people like Margaret Sanger and the birth of those who contested restrictions on contraception, on obscenity, eventually on abortion, and ultimately in terms of gay rights. And then turns in the second part of the book to the Supreme Court's own decisions and tries to connect these different strands of constitutional law, tries to show the relationships between the court's approach to issues of obscenity and reproductive rights and gay rights and same-sex marriage and so on, and to show the interactions between those different themes. And I should say the book concludes on a kind of tentatively triumphalist end, where we have, both by social movements and by the actions of the judiciary, come a long way over the last 60 years across all of these issues. But it's tentative because the fact is that almost all of the critical decisions were 5-4 decisions. We are again at a point in our history when the makeup of the court is very much up in the air. And it is not at all unimaginable that with a President Trump and 1 or 2 vacancies on the Supreme Court being filled by President Trump, that all those decisions are vulnerable. And most obviously on the realm of reproductive rights and abortion, but also on the rights of gays and lesbians and transgender persons. The progress that we've made could in many ways be reversed and certainly be halted. And so I think it's a point where the work of this center in continuing to pursue these issues, understand them, understand the implications not only academically but for society and for the law is really fundamental. And so I'm delighted at the work that the center does and the role I've been able to play in it. Thank you.
Technically, we're out of time, but since we have an hour for lunch, I'd like us to be able to take a few questions, so please.
Okay, well, hello. Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you guys for being here. I mean, as a graduate student who has benefited from the center and its resources and our teachers, and I think I could speak for kind of all of us here, it has been really amazing. So my question is not totally specific to the center necessarily, but more of a curiosity, which was I was hoping that the 2 legal scholars on the panel, Martha and Jeff, could respond a little bit to the problem that was set out about what it looks like to translate rights in a context in which rights are not always the only form and space of sort of discrimination or political processes.
Well, you know, that's something that in the international work I've done, I've grappled with a lot. And I actually prefer the language that our group, I mean, this an international group, our Human Development and Capability Association has members from 80 different countries. But the language of human capabilities is to me more neutral. I mean, of course, I don't think that rights are exclusively Western. In fact, I think rights have not been Western enough. But there is that debate and there is that perception. So what I prefer is the idea that human beings are entitled to be and do certain things, and then one could spell that out. And most of my normative work on capabilities is profited by studying the constitutions of India and South Africa. Those are the 2 nations that most inspire me. And I feel that we've encountered on the ground a great response to the language of capabilities, because people, no matter whether they've ever thought normatively or legally, they're asking themselves, what can I do? What am I able to do? And so that's a much more kind of immediate, on-the-ground way of approaching things and formulating it. And it's not as though it's totally distinct from rights analysis. There is a lot of overlap. But anyway, so that's what I've been doing.
I always have a question. So I'm Amanda. I'm one of Linda's students in the political science department. So my question is more of like historical view of, we've heard about the texts that have transformed you, and now I think a lot of us have been transformed by your text. And so what was that transition like for you as a scholar from being someone who is influenced by all these texts to then helping to foster students be able to create those texts potentially by using some of your own work?
You should answer that, because you're the youngest. You're the youngest one. So.
But I think that's why I probably shouldn't, because I'm still being transformed. But sure.
Sure.
You know, it's... I sometimes feel like a dilettante because I started by as a historian of South Asia, and then wrote this book on post-colonial theory and history, and now I'm in cinema. So, and in my head, there is actually a link between all of these things, and it's one of the links is, in fact, gender and sexuality, and the other is my post-colonial vantage. But really, what I want to say is that, I don't think I've ever stopped being a student, so I continue to be transformed by the people I'm in conversation with, the people I read, the people who are dead. And I think that's my goal in the classroom. This is again something I've said to various students. I don't think I'm an activist, but really I consider the classroom my space of activism. I mean, if I can call it that. And I suppose the one thing that I do try in the classroom to accomplish is to get people to feel as excited as I do. And I think that once that happens, you produce good work. Whether that's a transformational text or not remains to be seen, but it's good work.
I guess I have something to say to this. Nobody could really answer your question, because then they would have to be talking about the impact they had, and who knows. But I thought I would say three things in response to it. And one is, I'm really interested in a non-mimetic pedagogy. That is, how is it that you can teach people without making them feel like you're trying to reproduce yourself in them? And so what are the kinds of things you can do to get them to have a free relation to their thought, or a relation to their thought that might produce objects that don't look like they have a market yet, or aren't, or aren't recognizable yet, or what we were talking about this morning, which is inconvenient knowledge. How do you have inconvenient knowledge in the space of a discipline? And also, how can you, is there support for you having a kind of, the whole question of a cool or a hot academic tone? We raised a lot of issues this morning. That's one thing. The second thing is about work. I don't think I ever finish anything I write, but I just stop. I get tired. I get tired of it, and I have to get it out of my house. And so that's why I write series of things, because the work is ongoing. So it's not just like you wrote a big thing, now you have an impact. It's like you stopped writing that, but there's still unfinished questions, and you have to keep moving along with that. So I have been saying to my students, I want to have a tattoo here that goes, what would it mean to have that thought? And that's the kind of thing I would want to say about teaching and learning, which is that, you can read something, and if I ask you what you read, you can tell me what you read. But actually becoming changed by what you read is a long metabolizing process, and forever, And the thing that you thought you knew becomes the thing that you turned out not to have known parts of, because you hadn't known everything yet. So everything changes because it's in context of other things. So. I think the emphasis on important books and important work is a really, that's just a kind of market issue. What's more important is that you have fidelity to the unfinished part of what you've thought yet, and keep having fidelity to that. That's what I would say.
So I agree with both of you, and I just wanted to add that one of the things that I found really important is that in classrooms, conversations often get very uncomfortable, and it's really important to go right through them, and through silences, the way that we did in asking for a question. And that turns out to be hugely important in getting people to actually read carefully, because reading comes in many different forms, and then to engage with the reading, not to mime it back, but to have some sort of connection to it that might be violent or conflictual. So as a matter of classroom and even one-on-one teaching, I think that moment of silence and of possible conflict and discomfort is really important.
And I would just say it, really, in a way, the point of my remarks were that we're engaged in a conversation, and that's something we always say about what we do as scholars, but I wanted to make it very concrete. Work that comes before us enables us to raise certain questions, to ask certain things, to think in new ways, and we try to intervene in that conversation. And maybe we move it a little bit forward, and then the conversation keeps moving forward. And eventually we have to go back and rethink the work that we've done before through the new lenses that are made possible by all the work of our generation. And so in a way, I think I've become more generous in my reading of work, realizing that everyone is doing their little bit to try to engage with these questions, move them forward. And maybe we disagreed with some of the things they've said, but they helped us think anew about questions. It's often said, it's a problem of graduate classrooms where the only thing you learn to do is slash and burn. And in fact, to think about how can you really take from this work and be inspired by it, learn from it, and move it forward. But also to say that in a really profound way, I think all of us are students of one another, and so I feel like I'm just all the time learning from my graduate students. Certainly anyone who's writing a dissertation is getting so much more deeply into something, some problem than I ever could, and I'm learning from that. And in the classroom, people are bringing not just the work that they've read, that maybe I've read more of in some areas than they have, but not in others, but also a generational experience that's different from my own. That means they take certain things for granted that we had to really figure out, and they're exploding other things that we'd taken for granted. So it's part of the thrill and the excitement and the pleasure of doing this work.
Break for lunch.